Hello, I'm Devin, and you're listening to the 9th episode of Tools and Craft, a series of conversations with the designers, engineers, writers, and inventors who are shaping computing as we know it. Today, I'm talking with Howard Rheingold. Howard first plugged into the internet in 1983, before the World Wide Web even existed. He was one of the first non-programmers to see computers as mind amplifiers rather than just computing or word processing machines. And he coined the word virtual community through his experience as a member of the Well, one of the first online communities, and he's thought in depth about collective action and coordination online. He's been on the web for so long, there's a lot of other things that he has done on computers, but that's just a quick taste, and I'm sure y'all will get a better sense as we dive in. So Howard, thank you so much for taking the time to chat. I've been really looking forward to this.
Me too.
So one goal of the ARPANET design was to be resilient to nuclear attack, which is why the internet today has a decentralized packet switching infrastructure, enabling it to avoid a single point of failure. What were the social consequences of this decentralized design?
I could be wrong about this, but my understanding from my conversations with Bob Taylor was that packet switching had been invented by some people at RAND Corporation in order to create a decentralized way of communicating during a nuclear attack. That was not the reason that ARPANET adopted it. ARPANET adopted it because I guess it was AT&T or Bell Telephone, the switched network that existed at that time was the telephone network. And if you remember old movies of switchboard operators making connections, a switch network literally creates a circuit between the listener and the speaker. And what I was told by Bob Taylor was that the switch network people, the telephone people, didn't believe that packet switching would work for this. They adopted packet switching. The network was really enabled by the understanding that they could create a computer on the network that would speak to other computers on other networks. I guess we call that a router these days. So I'll have to tell you, I'm not much of a technical expert, but actually when I first started out writing, I talked myself into a job at Xerox PARC doing some writing there. They gave me assignment of helping some of their scientists publish who were good scientists, but were procrastinators on publishing. And one of the first jobs I had was two people, one Jim White and Yogan Dalal, and I think Yogan Dalal later became a venture capitalist. And they had a paper on the way that the packet encapsulated the structure of the network. And helping them write that, I spoke to them and we made recordings and I did transcripts and we talked about the transcripts. It was like being given a paper in Greek and a Latin dictionary and speaking neither of those languages. But what stuck with me was the way that the structure of the packet enabled communications to move through this network very fluidly, in that when a computer received a packet, the first, it would unwrap it, and the first thing it would read would be about where that packet was headed. And if it wasn't headed for that computer, it would throw it in that general direction of that computer, et cetera, et cetera. So packet switching is really an essential part of the ARPANET. But as I was told, the reason for creating the ARPANET was that ARPA was sponsoring computer research at a number of different places at University of California, at University of Utah, at MIT, and they met in person a couple of times a year, the computer science researchers, and they began wanting to run the programs on one computer center from another computer center. And so that's how they started. It was really to connect these disparate projects technically. What happened along with that was that along with the technical connection, the programmers started using the network to communicate with each other. And I think that the real genius of JCR Licklider and Bob Taylor, who were running the project, was that instead of saying, you guys shouldn't be talking about science fiction, one of the first lists was about SF lovers, about science fiction. You should be talking about your work. They understood that they were creating a new kind of communication network. And in fact, they wrote a paper that I recommend called The Computer as a Communication Device. And in fact, Licklider called it the Intergalactic Network. And they mused about what would happen when most of humanity is online.
We'll definitely have to include a link to that in the transcript. I'm sure a lot of people will want to read it. There's a quote that I think you quoted in something that you wrote from John Gilmer, where he said, "The net interprets censorship as damage and routes around it," which I thought was like a very evocative way to describe the architecture of the net. How has that played out in practice, and like what sorts of interactions have people had as a result that maybe wouldn't have been possible in like a Bell telephone centralized system?
Gilmore disavows being the person to have invented that. And it's unclear who actually invented that phrase. And I think it's pretty clear now that it turned out to be wrong. I mean, you've got the Great Firewall in China, but the end-to-end principle that any node on the network can communicate with any other node on the network really led to a lot of the innovation that led to the web and the online culture we see today. I thought of it when I first started in terms of the social dimension, which is that you could communicate with someone who shared a particular interest, whether you knew that person before or even whether they were on the same side of the planet as you. And that is enormously important today. If the example I often use is if you have a disease that 1 in a million people have, there are 2,000 others and you can connect with them. We're also discovering that if that rising tide lifts all boats, it lifts the pirate ships as well as the hospital ships. So you can have medical support groups and you can have Nazis who are able to connect with each other in ways that they weren't able to connect with each other before. And I think that's one of the most important aspects of the end-to-end principle. The other one being that you don't have to ask permission and you don't have to rewire the network in order to innovate. As long as whatever you're doing on your node, you can take your computer and plug it into the network and disseminate the World Wide Web, for example. If it speaks the protocols of the internet, if it moves the packets around technically the way they're supposed to, then no, you don't have to get permission to do it. The Google guys didn't have to ask permission to create a new search engine from their dorm room, and Tim Berners-Lee didn't have to rewire the web in order to disseminate HTML. So I think that those are to me the two most important aspects of just the technicality of what they call the end-to-end principle, which I think illustrates the way that a technical architecture can result in enormous social changes.
Absolutely. When I first went to college, I was planning to study mechanical engineering, but as soon as I took my first programming class, I realized, oh man, this is the real stuff. Because I realized that I didn't need permission to do anything. I could just put up a website and it would just start working. And maybe no one wanted to go to it, and that was my problem. But I didn't need any permission to make it happen. And so I quickly changed my major because of that feeling of like, man, it's just me and my computer, and then suddenly I've like potentially done something that tons of people can use, or not in most the cases of most projects.
These days, in terms of the giant monopolies, a lot of people have forgotten or never learned that the web as we know it was really created by people like you and I, who just put up our websites and link to our friends' websites and put up pictures of our pets. It was not a corporation. In fact, if you said, I plan to make money on the internet before Netscape, people would laugh at you. And it wasn't the government. The government enabled the technology and supported the creation of the technology, enabled the transition of the National Science Foundation network to the internet, but it wasn't really, the government didn't create the web.
What are the pockets of communities that still view the internet in those ways? Like, where do you see that spark of people still viewing the web as something that can be co-created as opposed to something that Facebook has to make a web page for you?
Well, I think that's one of the big issues of the day when you're talking about the tragedy of the commons or the commons, there's the enclosure of the commons, the literal common land that the peasants were able to graze on in England was fenced in, and if you tried to use it, you were shot or hanged, and that's called enclosure. And I feel that Facebook is trying to enclose the internet. It's trying to make people believe that it is the internet. But we've got all kinds of conversations going on in all kinds of places. Just Reddit itself is a ecology full of communities of people who share a particular interest. So, it's like the big companies kind of own the loaf, but there's lots of raisins inside it, and a lot of little communities inside it. I mentioned medical support communities. I wrote about that back in 1987. It was surprising to us in the well when we formed a support community for a parent whose son had developed leukemia. Now, of course, that's not surprising. I mean, who has not Googled their symptoms? And people who have diseases or are caregivers for diseases, they know how to contact support groups online. And, the same thing goes for engineers. We probably wouldn't have the internet as we know it today if the companies then in Silicon Valley had realized that their engineers were using the network to talk with engineers at other companies and solve problems together, to share lore and knowledge. So I think sharing lore is another thing that people do without even thinking about it. I think there are a lot of these threads that connect people either through their personal lives, like medical support groups, or through their professional lives, sharing lore. Long before LinkedIn, that was how you found out about where jobs were. I think that when the web first started, everybody who was putting up a website understood that we were creating it. Nowadays, people who were born into an age where Facebook dominated I don't think all understand that they have that capability, that anybody can innovate and create something new. They can create a new Tumblr, or they can create a new Reddit, as people have done. And of course, things spring up, new ways of communicating spring up, and people invent new art forms, new cultural forms around them. TikTok didn't exist a few years ago. I can remember when video online was extremely slow and only nerds used it. So I have a lot of faith that it's sort of like water will always find its own level. If there's a new way to communicate, people will find it and invent new forms that quite often, in fact, almost always, the people who invented the technical means of communicating did not have in mind.
I have this ongoing group chat with some of my friends on Facebook Messenger, and something we talk about on and off is how it feels very impersonal. Like in Facebook Messenger, iMessage, WhatsApp, all of these, they all look more or less the same for every group. And that has its uses because it means that you have a standardized interface and like everyone knows how to use it. But on the other hand, it doesn't really feel like it's your place. It feels like you're like living and communicating in this like institutional setting as opposed to this shared space that you like create together, like a studio you might have with your friends. And so something we daydream about is often like making our own messaging chat just for ourselves, not to like sell or something, but just for ourselves, for our own uses, to make it almost more like a scrapbook. And this is something I'm always tempted to go off and build, but it actually is hard to build a chat app that is good and useful. So I've held myself back up until now. But I think the more I think about it, the more I'm going to have to do it one day, I think.
I wrote a short essay on Patreon in response to this idea of Facebook enclosure. If you want to start a forum or you want to start a chat group or you want to start a mailing list, the tools are there. You can create your own communities. People can make their own substitutes for Facebook for their small group. I don't want that to be lost. I don't want that skill of just taking what's available online and rolling your own. When Slack came along, a lot of old timers said, "Wait, this looks like a IRC. It's IRC with a little bit of a fanciness in the interface." And I think certainly there is proven to be value in taking the technical skeleton of things that have existed for a long time and make them look a little friendlier.
Yeah. So, on that note, actually, how did the internet culture change when the World Wide Web was invented in 1989?
Well, you have to remember that the internet was almost entirely text. There were people exchanging images, most of them pornographic, on Usenet, and that had to do with transmitting long uh, uh, passages of gibberish that you had to decode. So the idea that you would have pictures or video or sound was kind of it was so distant as to be invisible to most people. I think people who understood where Moore's law was taking technology knew that eventually the internet would be multimedia. In fact, Alan Kay in 1977 in the Scientific American, in an article called Microelectronics in the Personal Computer, talked about the internet being a meta medium. The ability to link, of course, hypertext has been an idea for quite a while since Ted Nelson and Doug Engelbart. But when you put the multimedia together with the hypertext, you get a basis for all sorts of things. The idea that people would use the web, A, to make money, really exploded after the internet, after the Netscape IPO. I was involved with starting Hot Wires, which was Wired Magazine's online venue, and we put ads. I think in just a short period of time, I don't know whether it's hours or days, more video was uploaded to YouTube than in all the history of broadcast televisions. And we knew that we would be able to manipulate images, but nobody really dreamed of Photoshop when we saw Mech Paint. So I think that the technology enabled accelerated evolution. People saw, oh, we can put a picture up. What can we do with pictures? Oh, you can upload videos. What can we do with video? And of course, we've seen that's gone in so many different directions, and not all of them healthy ones. So again, sometimes people ask, has the web is it good or bad? And I think, well, are humans good or bad? Well, at the point where you've got a significant portion of the human race online, and not just technical experts and scientists and academics, you're going to get the full spectrum of human behavior, and some of that is not so pretty. And previously you could hide a lot of that not so pretty stuff. It wasn't visible to everybody. But again, every node can talk to every other node. If you wanted to seek out the ugly stuff, or if the YouTube algorithm believes it will cause you to be more engaged, you can swiftly get involved with some very nasty stuff online. So you asked about culture. You can't really leave that out. I think the inventiveness. I understand that pornography has driven new technologies for a long time. That not long after the printing press became widespread, there was pornography about the French royalty. And again, the video recorder was driven by people who didn't want to go to the store to buy porn. So I think humans are a mixture. All humans are a mixture, and so is our culture, and so is the online culture. I think the online culture does amplify some things, and things like, for example, the YouTube algorithm does drive people towards the unhealthy content.
What you said about evolution of culture online and evolution of technological advancement online has got me thinking. One of the reasons why the evolution has sped up in on certain dimensions is because software is so malleable. You can kind of like poke at it and fiddle with it, and if it breaks, it's actually fine because you just like rerun it or you press undo. Versus, I don't know, if you want to innovate on building a house or something, if you mess up, like someone might die. And so I feel like it makes software and software tools much more playful because you can just kind of poke at it until it does the thing that was interesting, as opposed to having to worry about the consequences. Now, certainly there are consequences, and you wouldn't want like the software that, I don't know, accepts credit card payments to be fiddled with in that way. But Photoshop, you can just kind of like apply some filter over something or some algorithm and be like, oh wow, that made a really interesting like visual effect on this piece of art, or oh man, that didn't look good at all, I'm gonna undo it.
You know, there's a French word for that. They call it bricolage. A bricoleur is someone who just throws a lump of clay onto the table and messes with it until a form emerges. And in my experience, when you're trying to create something, there are usually two different approaches to it, and sometimes, quite often, you have people who embody both different approaches. There are people who want a blueprint and a timeline and milestones and objective measures of every step, and there are people who just want to mess with this part of the code and see what happens. And I think the most interesting developments are when those two mindsets uh, collide, and they have to find a way that they can work together, and either side can do things that the other side can't. And if they have to agree on something, then they need to find something that fits both ways of doing things. But certainly we wouldn't have the web today if it wasn't for view source. I remember not being a coder at all, that I could find a web page that did something I really liked, and I could view source, and I could copy that source, and I could find all the places where it mentioned that specific website and just change the mention to my stuff, and bang, I had something there. And I think that that's one of the reasons that the web has spawned so many different cultures, is that ability to build on what other people have done, even if you're not entirely knowledgeable about what it is they did.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I remember some of my first experiences programming were WordPress sites, and I had no idea what was going on with any of it, but I did know that like if I saw the word red and I wanted to replace it with the word purple, suddenly my page would be purple, and that was cool. And from there you start pulling the thread and you start realizing like, oh, this the place where it says on click, maybe that has something to do with clicking, and you kind of like you pull the thread until it all unravels in a good way.
Well, the great thing about WordPress is that there's a very large community. And if you've got a problem or you have an innovation that you want to incorporate, the skill of finding who knows what is really important. And in terms of programming, the site where if you've got a programming question, you put it up and
Oh, Stack
somebody,
Overflow?
yeah, Stack Overflow.
Mhm.
How did programmers work before Stack Overflow? I mean, think about that. It's this again, that ability to connect with a person, even though you don't know who that person was. In this case, it's who is the person who's encountered this particular programming issue. Oh my God! You put it up. Not only do people answer your questions, in most cases they've already answered the question, and I think that ability to lean on a community of people who are not only knowledgeable but willing to share. I think that willing to share part was really built in, not to the technical infrastructure, but culture that developed out of the early internet and the early web.
This is something I find even I surprise myself with, where like I contribute to this open source tool called Logseek, and I sometimes just like sit in their Discord. And when I say sometimes, I mean like a few days a week. I'll just sit in their Discord channel answering questions about it, and I don't know why I do that. It's just fun, but I would not expect that I would spend my time that way, if that makes sense from an outside view. But I kind of get pulled in, and I feel very happy when I get to explain things to people.
That is a key question. When I was writing my book, The Virtual Community, in 1991, 1992, I found it very hard to find academic experts who could answer my questions. I did find a graduate student at UCLA by the name of Mark Smith. And I asked Mark, why do people spend time giving information to other people they don't know? And he said, knowledge capital, social capital, and communion. And I think that he was right. And in fact, when I taught social media issues and social media literacies to college students, I had a, a week that was devoted to social capital online. And, most of these formal terms I discovered after trying to find out what people said about what I knew what was happening. And I became excited about life online when I discovered that if I freely gave out information to people who are looking for it, I would get 10 times as much back when I asked for it. And that's essentially social capital. It's people accomplishing things together outside the formal frameworks of contracts or laws, and it's essential to human life. If, with farmers, if you break your leg and it's harvest season, then if you have good relationships with your neighbors, they will take in the harvest. And, the classic is the Amish barn raising. So I think that's another essential part of online culture, and reciprocity is part of it. Is I discovered called diffuse or indirect reciprocity. So you have a question, I give you the answer, even though I don't know you and you may never reciprocate to me directly, but we both belong to the same community in which we know that others are going to answer my question, even if they don't know me. So, in fact, that's a deep principle of how human cooperation has come to evolve. So I think that there's both a technical architecture and some principles of the way humans operate that have combined to create things like that. Again, I learned all these things because I was interested in why does it work this way. There was a sociologist by the name of Manker Olson who wrote a book called The Logic of Collective Action. And that was considered the last word on the subject, in which he pretty much declared that public goods, things that no one in particular is responsible for, like, well, I don't know, keeping the sidewalk clean, are not going to be created by groups of people who are not financially compensated or related to each other or are very large at all. And of course, open source came along, Wikipedia came along, and the web came along. And those are all, whatever the opposite of an existence proof is, it proves that the logic of collective action needs to be revised, that people will create public goods together. There's a book by Steven Weber called The Success of Open Source, in which he actually dealt with some surveys of open source contributors, and the reasons, I may not get this exactly right. The number one reason was learning how to program. A number two reason was monetizing their ability to program. And number three reason was contributing to a public good. And the fourth reason was sticking it to Microsoft. So it turns out that when you're dealing with public goods online, having a couple of characteristics makes it more successful. And one of them is a number of different motivations for doing it. And another one that works very well for open source programming and Wikipedia is self-election. I may be obsessed with a particular kind of South American ant, so that's what I'm going to decide to write about on Wikipedia. Or I think, interestingly, I am a programmer and there's a new printer and nobody has a driver for it. So I've got to create that driver. I might as well contribute that driver to the public so that other programmers who need to connect to that printer can use it. But also I'm signaling that I'm a cooperator, and when I need help, someone will help me. All of this is enabled by the technical architecture, but it's really driven by the human social factors.
Yeah, I think the self-election is a big part of why people are motivated, and it is, I think, a very powerful positive force. I think it has some gaps though too, which is like some projects are just more charismatic than others. So, I imagine that the Wikipedia page for kittens has probably been updated more often than like snails. I don't know. I haven't actually checked if that's true, but I would hazard a guess. And there's probably some much more obscure animal that I've never even heard of, that very few people pay attention to, that like has very little information written about it. Or similarly with open source software, I think a lot of software tools get a lot more attention and work on them when they are at the, sort of the top of the stack, the like UI layer, the part that actually interacts with humans, where the people actually see it, as opposed to the transitive dependencies that software might rely on. So I think that is one of the limitations of that. But it doesn't make self-election bad. It just means that we need other types of reasons to work on something that fill in those gaps. Who are those people in the early days of the internet and then of the World Wide Web?
Well, in the creation of the internet, a lot of it was done through email. They called it RFCs, requests for comment. And so people would, as you know, programmers have strong ideas. They would argue about things technically. But there was a fellow who kind of ran the mailing list who's died a few years ago by the name of John Postel. And everybody trusted him to not be in a particular faction. So I think the philosophy behind the people who created the internet was rough consensus and running code. And so rough consensus is important because anyone who's participated in consensus based activities that are strict consensus finds that they go on and on and on, and there's always somebody who's going to stop it. Oscar Wilde said of socialism, it requires too many evenings. Consensus requires too much meta conversation. So having someone that everybody trusted was really important, I think, to that.
It's really useful in a group, in advance of having to approach big decisions, is to sort of make the meta decision of who will just make a call when it comes to it. It's an incredibly valuable thing that you can do, because otherwise, if you don't do that and you all respect each other and want everyone to agree, then you end up in this situation where you don't do anything at all.
I think it's important to go back to your original question to understand that it was really the extraordinary leadership of J.C.R. Licklider and Robert Taylor, who were at ARPA when all of this business started. Taylor was, I think, in his 20s and had been a NASA administrator, and J.C.R. Licklider was older, and he had done some war work at MIT, and so when ARPA was created, they had this little office called the Information Processing Techniques Office. It was really a tiny thing, but he understood where interactive computing was going, and he hired Taylor, and they did things like fund Doug Engelbart, and they funded Ivan Sutherland, who invented computer graphics, who later succeeded them at ARPA, and they funded Alan Kay. There came a time when the US Congress said, this ARPA, that's supposed to be for the Defense Department. This was during the Vietnam War. Now, if you're not working on things that the military can use right away, we don't want you to do it. So a lot of people quit. And Bob Taylor was hired by the Xerox company to invent the information architecture of the future. And they gave him $100 million and 10 years with no interference. And he went and hired all of those ARPA engineers who were all, pretty young graduate students from the University of Utah and University of California and all over the place, and brought them to Palo Alto and put them in the same building. And the architecture of the building was organized in these pods where if you had to get from one place to another, you had to go through a place where people were having conversations. And they had beanbag chairs all over the place and whiteboards all over the place. These were people who had been used to working with the old technologies of getting on the airplane or getting on the train and getting together and working with blackboards. Now they had this integrated facility. And I think that it would not have happened if it had not been for the extraordinary trust that people had in Bob Taylor from that. And these were all very strong personalities. If you've ever talked to or read anything by Alan Kay, you know that he was had a very strongly opinionated person, and there were a lot of others there as well. And they, of course, built on the work of Doug Engelbart, and they were the ones that led me to Doug Engelbart. If you're interested in this part of the history, Bob Taylor and John Markoff did a video at the University of Texas at Austin a few years ago that's completely fascinating. You know, Taylor's a Texan, and he has this kind of down home way of talking about things, and he's got lots of great stories about where the bodies are buried. So, and that's where I came into the picture, was that I had been a professional writer, or trying to make a living as a writer, for some years, and I was tired of typewriters. You know, you type out a page and then you mark it up and then you have to retype it. It's a pain. And I heard a rumor that you could use computers and screens and move words around without having to retype them. I went to Apple, which at that time was in 2 buildings. I talked to Jeff Raskin, who later was kind of the initiator of the Macintosh project. And he said, no, you can't really do word processing on Apple IIs, because the hardware only supports uppercase, because the founders believe that people are almost exclusively going to use these computers for playing games and writing code in BASIC. So that's when I came across Alan Kay's 1977 article, and I thought, Xerox PARC must be the coolest place to work if you're interested in the future of this technology. And I talked my way into a job there, and part of that job was interviewing people. When I interviewed Bob Taylor, he turned me on to Doug Engelbart. And when I met Doug Engelbart, that's when I really understood that this was not just a far better typewriter. This was a mind amplifier, or as he called it, augmenting human intellect, and that the future of mind amplifiers was going to explode as the technology did. As Alan Kay said back then, everybody knows where the silicon is going. So if you can put a pixel on a screen, in not too many years, you're going to put 1 million pixels on the screen. You're going to enable them to move around. So what does that have to do with how we think and communicate? And that I still believe is the most important aspect of the technology. You know, Engelbart had a hard time getting people to listen to him. It took him 10 years. He had this vision actually in the 1950s of people using screens and computers to collaborate, but the computer UC Berkeley said, and there were about 4 or 5 computers in the West Coast then. UC Berkeley said, well, you can study computer science here, but don't talk about these mind amplifiers. It's crazy. And he went to Hewlett Packard, and they said that they were never going to get into digital technology. And so finally he understood that people did not understand that computers, which were used exclusively for scientific computations and business data processing, were, as Alan Turing said many years ago, universal machines, that you could get them to do lots of other things. So he wrote that paper on augmenting human intellect, which I taught to every class that I taught, and which I still recommend to people, and particularly engineers who are trying to build things today, because they called it the unfinished revolution. Although the paper was published in 1962, everything that he foresaw has not really come to pass yet.
What are the gaps?
Well, he had this framework he called HLAMT, humans using language, artifacts, methodology, and training. And in the years after that, Engelbart often pointed out that the artifacts, the computers and the networks, evolved to something literally millions and billions of times more powerful. But how much progress has been made in the language, methodology, and training part of that? And I think that applies to the future of thinking tools. I think it's going to have less to do with the technology and more to do with how people learn, and how people learn to use it, and how they learn to extend their minds. And I'm sure you have the same thing I do, which is I offload an awful lot of my memory to Google, and it's outward brain. I use it 100 times a day. Sometimes I can't remember something exactly, but I know a couple of characteristics of it, and I search on them and I find it. And the book goes into a lot of detail about three aspects. One is the body, um, and some fascinating scientific research about, for example, stockbrokers don't even know that stockbrokers who can hear their heartbeat. Some people can hear their heartbeat, some people can't, that people who are more tuned into their bodily sensations make more successful decisions, even though they don't know that that's the aspect of it. So the body has part of it. And gestures are a big part of thinking, for example. So body is part of it. The environment is part of it. And then again, the technological extensions that like the computer and the network. So I think we're only really beginning to learn the literacy of mind amplification, that the tools are all there.
I mean, I think one thing that I've only come to really appreciate in the last few years is how physical thinking is, or should be, in the sense that I think one of the things that attracted me to software, to computers, to the internet was how abstract and like in my head it felt. That was really, really cool because I could have a whole little world in my head. But I've come to realize that actually a lot of the intuitions that you have for how something works are physical intuitions. And also having a space that is sort of an extension of your mind, or almost not a visualization, but I'll give an example. I have a friend who has his own personal gaming arcade. So he has like a separate apartment that he rents out, and he has like DDR machines, pinball machines, that kind of thing in there. And this space, you go in and you just feel like you're inside of Roger's brain. It's awesome. And it's something where as soon as I saw it, I was like, oh man, I can see how this place helps him think. It helps him think the types of thoughts he wants to have. It's also a very fun place to be. And so something I've been worrying about is I think that a lot of the tools that we have are very contained within little rectangles, and they're very powerful. But I think there's probably limitations there. I don't know. A lot of the greatest scientific discoveries have happened because of scientists who sort of felt things in their body. I've heard stories of Feynman, like who was a scientist at Los Alamos, like rolling around on the ground, like grappling with problems and like feeling it in his arms and stuff like that. Which, I don't think I understand physics enough to understand exactly what he was going through, but it helps him solve problems and helps him wrap his mind around it. So, like, how do you approach teaching these skills to your own daughter?
Pretty recently, if you're talking about the history of education, you've got YouTube, you've got Wikipedia, you've got search, you've got uh, forums and chat, you've got open educational resources. Why can't a group of people get together and learn something together, even though they don't have a teacher or an educational institution? What's really missing is knowing how to do that. How do you want to learn a subject? How do you find out what are the best sources on that subject? And how do you arrange those sources into a syllabus? And what media are you going to use? How are you going to assess your learning? How are you going to divide the work of being the teacher for the day? So I started a project called Peeragogy, Peeragogy. And it's interesting because I was invited to give a lecture about learning at Berkeley. And at the end of my lecture, I called for creating a handbook for learning online without a teacher. And part of this invited lecture was I was supposed to meet with the faculty and graduate students in a face-to-face seminar for several times after the lecture. And I did, but I brought my laptop and I opened it up to a video conferencing system circa 2011. After a couple of months, all of the people, the faculty and the graduate students I met with face to face had dropped out of the project. But educators from Mexico and Brazil, the UK, Germany, Japan had come in online and had created a community, and it's still going. I think the Peeragogy Handbook is in its fourth or fifth edition. You can go to peeragogy.org and get connected to it for free. There's an ongoing community that anybody can join. So I think part of what people need to learn is not just how to find information online, but how to use these amazing resources to learn together online. And of course, schools are quite resistant to this. When I was at Stanford, I was concerned about the fact, well, why are there so few of the faculty using forums and wikis? And I went to someone who was in charge of a Center for Innovations and Learning, and he said, well, the answer to that is easy. This is a knowledge factory, and people are hired here because of their publications, their contributions to their field. And if you're supposed to teach a class and you never show up, that could be a problem. But there's no positive incentives for innovating in teaching in that system. And I found when I was actively involved in digital media and learning that the real innovators were not at the knowledge factories. They were at some small liberal arts school, University of Mary Washington. I think a lot of people may have never heard of that, but that's where I found some great innovations in open learning. And I in fact, over a period of years, interviewed more than 100 innovators in digital media and learning. And I'm afraid that what happens in most fields has to happen in education is that the old people have to retire and the young people have to take over. But an awful lot of them are flying under the radar now and using, not just the face-to-face elements that go back to, ancient Samaria, but the media that students live in when they're not in school as well.
How did computers and the internet change your relationship with your family?
Oh, well, that's actually when I started writing about it was, I think the opening line of my book, The Virtual Community, is my daughter saying, Mommy, Daddy is laughing at his computer again. I had been writing for quite a while before I got a computer and a modem, and it was just miraculous to me to discover that there were all these interesting people saying interesting things, and I could talk with them. And in fact, it was kind of writing as a performing art. Instead of waiting for the thing to be published and printed, and maybe someday somebody would say something to you about it, it was moving that into real time, and I was spending hours a day on it. And so finally, my wife became concerned about that, so I started writing articles about it. I wrote Virtual Communities for the Whole Earth Review in 1987. So okay, that's legit. So I really don't think of myself so much as a pioneer as a early participant observer. Not only was this fascinating to me as a writer, but the tools were something that a writer's dream. It's like I started out with a horse and buggy, and now I have my own spaceship. It's amazing to think what's of course I use search 100 times a day, but they've got things like Deven Think and the brain and all kinds of other kind of knowledge management tools and thinking tools and online concept mapping. I think the large end of the funnel for a writer has gotten so big that you can gather so much more information that it causes some problems at the small end of the funnel. How am I going to integrate all of this? And tools that take all of the little snippets that you've gathered and show you ways that they could be organized or which ones might relate to each other are tremendous help. I think that there's still a long way to go in that. You still have to take everything that you have discovered and arrange it in serial order. If you're writing a book or you're writing an article, it's still got to come out in that serial order. I know this is a little off topic, but I remember when we were first starting Hotwired, we were very aware that we were creating a new medium, and that whatever we did, people would follow. And I remember a meeting that was strictly about, we need to have a feature in which people write essays in which they include links. Stop for a second. That sounds so weird, doesn't it? I mean, don't we all naturally include links when we're writing these days? It's part of the literacy of writing. Back in those days, it was something that you really had to think about. So anyway, back to family. It really helped when I was traveling, when I did a lot of speaking and traveling, to be in touch with back home. I mean, being in touch was a lot harder back in the old days. There was a time when if you were in a different country and you wanted to make a call to the U.S., you had to have the people in your hotel set it up and call you when it was ready to go. Of course, able to communicate with my daughter when she was in college and when she was away, and we still communicate every day. How many families have the family WhatsApp chat going on, or even some people have like a walkie-talkie app, so you can have people all over the world. I remember in the early days talking to a waitress in Sweden about this, and she said, "Well, I have one sibling in Australia and another one in Thailand, and if it wasn't for email, it would be very expensive for us to stay in touch." So there's a negative side of that, which is when you went to college, you used to kind of that you were on your own, and maybe you would call mom and dad or write mom and dad. But nowadays, like back before online maps, my daughter would call and ask, I'm trying to go to so and so address. How do I get there?" And so so many things have changed in human relations, including that of the family. And I think in some ways being able to be in touch all the time is a great innovation. In some ways, it's harder for young people to form their own personalities and kind of detach, leave home. They don't really leave home so much anymore.
One thing I think I don't fully appreciate, but every time I've learned about it, I've been more impressed is how different people use computers. Whenever I sit and watch a friend using a computer, or my parents, or anybody, they always use it quite differently than me. Sometimes it's like small things, like the text size on their phone is different than mine, and I forget that like you can even change that. Or sometimes it's deeper things like how did a friend set up their text editor or their terminal, things like that. I think it's really fun to see the rise of tools like Twitch for like video streaming and those sorts of things, where we can get a little bit more visibility into how other people use these tools. Because I think everything I know about computers really has either been from poking around myself or by incorporating things that I've other like sort of folk practices that I've seen other people use. So I think it's also about just like seeing other people use computers in ways that you didn't think of, or and also being able to transfer your knowledge to them directly. And it's very much like a peer-to-peer type of learning environment.
Well, again, when I was at Hotwired, I was 49, and my intern was 19, and I just surrendered the computer to him and let him configure it and let me show me how to use it. And I think it's really. I'm not a believer in the digital native. I don't believe that just because you're young, you know everything. Especially the social and political and ethical implications. But I believe that young people have a lot more time, and that they have this kind of peer network to learn whatever is the new way to communicate. And I think we need to older folks need to listen to the younger folks more.
I think there's a general myth of fluency, both for digital tools as well as language around youth, where I think a lot of people think like, oh, because I didn't learn a language when I was young, I'll never be able to pick it up. And it might be true that it might be hard to pick up certain sounds when you're speaking, or in the case of digital tools, you might not have certain intuitions. But I think that the experience that you bring to the table can give you different types of expertise in that space. So to like stretch the language analogy, I've been learning Spanish and I'm like almost fluent, but every once in a while I will invent a word without realizing that I invented a word. And my boyfriend, who's Argentinian, will often go, "Hey, that's not a real word, but I like it," you know? And he's like, "I know exactly what you mean, but also that's not a real word." I think similarly with digital tools, like, sure, maybe if you didn't grow up with it, you might not have quite as much certain types of the fluency, but in other ways, you're going to understand the system better, and you might have like a better mental model of like actually what's going on technically, as opposed to just sort of leaning in. So I think it might be true, like it's not that you come to the table necessarily with the same skills, but you come with different strengths.
Well, and also I think nobody of any age is able to encompass the kind of cultural cornucopia of innovations that are happening. When I started teaching college students in 2005, I was pretty sure that I knew more than they did about life online. By 2012, none of us knew everything there was about social media. So we started a kind of show and tell where every week a couple of students would show us what they were doing online that was really interesting. And most of the class learned something from that, whether it was, Tumblr or YouTube or Reddit. People were really into something and really understood it. And other people may have known it existed, but didn't know much about it. And I think that we're never going to be able to encompass it. I think we just need a culture of not being ashamed of learning from each other.
There is a certain part of internet culture, I think, where it's very self-reflective, and I don't mean to be offensive, but like navel gazing around people who sort of say like I'm an internet person and I know more about internet culture than other people do, and that's always sort of gotten on my nerves because I think it's like a certain part of internet culture, and it just happens to be the part that like is self-reflexive about the fact that it's on the internet. But we're actually all on the internet, and we all know different things about it. And I think that there's a certain moral superiority that some people come with, which I don't personally think is warranted.
I think socially, if we were just able to accept a new behavior of saying, "Wait, what? Can you teach me what that's about? I have no idea," and the other person saying, "Oh, sure, it works like this," I think we'd be a lot better off. I don't think you can learn all these things in school. I mean, you don't learn about cultural habits in school.
Many people who didn't grow up with computers or the web are a little intimidated by these technologies. I see this among some of my friends and some of my family members as well. By contrast, it seems like you pick up new tools and ways of interacting with them with a lot of enthusiasm. Actually, when we were entering this Zencaster recording, I think you figured out the audio before I did. What advice would you have to people who are a little intimidated by the prospect of diving into new technology?
There's an enormous value in just playing with things, and I think that if we valued fooling around with a new tool and just seeing what it might do, rather than I don't know, being embarrassed by not knowing how to work it, we would all benefit from that. Again, I think this is just it's social and cultural. I think that if we had a culture of learning from each other, if this pedagogy business got embedded in everything, and people weren't, I think what stops you from messing with something or asking something how it works is because you're afraid of the unknown, and you're going to make a mistake, and you're going to be embarrassed in front of people, or you're going to break something. I think that if we did away with that and just enabled people to play as they learn, and I think this applies to everything from K-12 to universities to learning how to operate a computer, we would advance our learning a lot better.
Well, that's a perfect place to stop. Thank you for taking part of your day to talk with me. This has been a super fun conversation.